10 Fascinating Facts About America's First Mega Prison. Eastern State Penitentiary, or ESP, in Philadelphia, was America's first large-scale penitentiary. The country had built jails before, of course. Jails of various kinds have long predated the United States, too. But never before was a mega prison built on the scale the state of Pennsylvania used when they first constructed it in the late 18th century. In many ways, the penitentiary became the blueprint for the modern mega prisons that dot the United States landscape today. Number 10. A big idea at Walnut Street Jail. When it came time to expand the Walnut Street Jail in 1821, the city of Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania put up $100,000. That was an astonishing amount of money at the time, of course. And the city wanted to recoup its investment by ensuring the prison would do its job. The Walnut Street Jail had been small, overcrowded, and ineffective. But the new Eastern State Penitentiary was to be a revolution in incarceration. Number 9. Soon, no expense is spared. For much of the 1820s, workers hurried to update and expand the Walnut Street Jail. By 1829, the expanded prison was mostly ready to open for business, as you might say. ESP had a radically original design for the time. It consisted of 7 cell blocks built out in a radial design like spokes on a bicycle wheel. Each block was composed of 76 different cells. To ensure complete separation of the prisoners, cells were split up with 18-inch, 45.7 centimeter thick stone walls. Inmates couldn't communicate with each other that way, prison officials reasoned. Number 8. Life in solitary. By the end of construction, most of the cells at ESP ended up measuring 12 by 8 feet, 3.7 by 2.4 meters. Those living in the prison were left inside their tiny holes for 23 hours a day, on average. They were limited to just an hour of exercise in the yard on most days, but only if they behaved accordingly. The prison also offered religious services to its inmates and expected them to follow along. The hope for Philadelphia Prison Society officials like Bradford was that the prison was perfectly designed to induce and effect reform in the minds of the prisoners. Number 7. Terrorized inmates and tortured souls. Solitary confinement in a tiny prison cell for 23 hours a day for years on end is its own form of torture. But in the early 19th century, prison officials didn't see it that way. Solitary, they felt, was the best way to break down unruly men and wash away their sins. So when inmates caused trouble at ESP, guards opted for even more draconian punishment techniques. For some, that meant using an early waterboarding technique of sorts. Number 6. ESP's infamous inmates. Like pretty much every penitentiary across America, ESP had no shortage of famous felons living within its walls. The prison was in active use for nearly 150 years. During that time, thousands of men were incarcerated there. Several had been notorious for their crimes out in the free world. Chief among them was a bank robber named William Francis Sutton. If you know his story at all, you may better recognize him by his nickname, Slick Willie. Number 5. Overflow brings despair. In 1835, after ESP fully opened its doors, the prison held about 250 inmates at any one time. But 5 decades later, that number had ballooned to unsustainable levels. By the late 19th century, the prison's population quadrupled. More than 1,000 inmates were packed tightly into quarters designed for far less than half of that number. As you might expect, death rates within prison walls were astoundingly high. Number 4. Fed-up inmates revolt. As conditions worsened over the years, inmates refused to take it sitting down. It was difficult to organize and plan revolts, especially while the men were still, mostly, held in solitary confinement. But as overcrowding became too bad to ignore, prisoners began to fight back. There were at least 3 major prisoner revolts in ESP's history and countless more minor skirmishes and standoffs. Number 3. Even dogs faced the music. As bad as ESP was, Those living within its confines tried to find little moments of happiness. In 1924, the most infamous of those joyous flashes came to be. On August 31st of that year, a mugshot was taken, and an intake form was registered for a new inmate. He was given the number C-2559. His crime was murder, and his sentence was for life. But this wasn't your average stone-cold killer. This was a black lab dog named Pep. According to legend, he had killed a beloved cat belonging to the wife of Pennsylvania's governor, Gifford Pinchot. Number 2. From torture to tourism? As we've mentioned already, and as we'll expand on in a moment, Eastern State Penitentiary closed down for good in 1971. Since it was shuttered, it has become quite a fascinating and morbid tourist attraction for Philly residents and out-of-town visitors alike. But that tourism trend actually started more than a century earlier. Even when ESP was in full operation, it was a tourist magnet for curious rubberneckers from all over the mid-Atlantic. Number 1. The end of Eastern State. After well over a century of terrible treatment, prisoners finally started to make headway in changing life inside especially. And by the 1950s, the state of Pennsylvania was looking more closely at how the prison was being run. That decade, the state officially changed its name to State Correctional Institution Philadelphia. The cell blocks were also reconfigured to incorporate a large-scale diagnostic center to help mentally ill inmates. It was an important development, but it wasn't enough.